Thank you for attending today's webinar. My name's Andrew Aiken from Contango Asset Management. Today we're going to be hearing from two of portfolio managers from WC Investment Manager. They're both based in Laguna Beach today, which looks a lot better than where we are here at the moment, and they've probably got their freedom as well, so lucky them. So I'll introduce you to Brian Huerta, who is a client portfolio manager. Hello, Brian.
Hi there, Andrew.
And also with him today is JB Horner, who JB, I just mentioned, is the star of the show today. He's the culture analyst that's worked with WCM Investment Management since 2014. It's quite a unique part of the investment process that not many other managers around the world would talk about culture and have it so embedded in their process as WCM do. And that framework was really developed or helped develop by JB. So we'll be talking to him in a lot of depth later on in this webinar. So welcome, JB.
Hi, Andrew, thanks.
Just a reminder to everyone, this is an interactive webinar. If you've got questions, send them through. We're happy to ask the guys at any stage during the webinar. I just briefly introduce WCM are the investment manager of the WCM Quality Global Growth Strategy. This can be accessed in Australia via an LIC, also by an ETMF, an exchange traded managed fund. And we also have two PDS unitized trusts. One is unhedged to currency and the other one is hedged. So they're the access points for the strategy that we're talking about today in Australia. I'm just going to start with Brian, if you don't mind, Brian, just to give us a bit of an introduction to WCM, its history, and how you go about investing.
Sure, I'd be happy to. And thanks everybody for tuning in today. As mentioned, I'm Brian Huerta. I'm one of the client portfolio managers. Just to give you a little bit of a background on WCM. WCM is based in Laguna Beach, California, probably one of the places you'd least expect to find a money manager. We're just a stone throw away from the beach here, and that's partly by design. And if we get a chance, maybe towards the end, we'll talk a little bit about our choice of a location. We're known for being quality global growth investors. We have quite a long history of identifying stocks and investing them for the long haul. We're a stable team as well. We've been around for some time, and the portfolio management team, the team that is overseeing this strategy, has been working together as a cohesive unit for more than a decade now. And what they say is, or one thing they do say is, we eat our own cooking here. Most of our portfolio managers and employees here invest their liquid net worth in the funds as well. So that's a little bit about WCM in our background. Happy to talk a little about the global growth strategy as well. Andrew, would you like me to kind of launch into there?
Please.
Sure. Well, it's the portfolio that we're really excited to talk about. It's our least constrained strategy. There are just literally thousands of stocks that we could choose from. We're looking for those special companies that have a proven ability to expand their competitive advantages and are supported by healthy and strong cultures. And they meet our strict criteria of quality. So it's, again, one of our least constrained strategies. It's one that a lot of the portfolio managers and the analysts and the employees of WCM all invest in as well. It's a high conviction strategy. And so we'll talk a little bit more about the philosophy and our process and how we go about the markets, but it gives you a little bit of sense as to what we're looking for and what's available to us in managing the strategy.
Yeah, one of the unique things for me has been your discussion around moats. Many managers talk about just an absolute moat and looking for a moat in a company. Of course, that's well understood. Can you sort of talk us through how you look at that differently?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I guess maybe just to start, just to define what a moat is. It's that body of water that maybe protects a business or its fortress, its cash flows, and it helps keep the competitors at arm's length. It's something, I think it's a concept that Warren Buffett started maybe in the 1990s. We certainly followed that idea around economic moats, but as we started to grow and evolve, we started to realize it also has some limitations and, quite frankly, some weaknesses in just looking for companies with wide economic moats. So we've taken it up a notch. We've even kind of added another filter to it, and are looking for companies that we think can expand their economic moats, that are growing their competitive advantage over time, over 5 years or more. So the focus is not what the company is doing now or what they've done in the past, but what they're going to do in the future. So we spent quite a bit of time understanding business models, business types, and how companies reinvest in their business to get stronger over the next 5 years. So the bar is quite high. We're looking for a low single-digit percentage of companies out of those thousands of stocks that we choose from that can meet the strict criteria. So that's a real important part of our process of understanding, competitive advantages and whether a company is able to expand them. It makes intuitive sense, right? Our view is that the competitive environment is always changing. It's quite dynamic, and companies are either getting stronger or they're getting weaker. And companies that lose their competitive edge often suffer. I think everyone probably on this webinar could relate to buying a growth stock and seeing that company lose their competitive edge and being on the wrong side of what we call that moat trajectory, that competitive advantage that's starting to slowly decay. It can be quite a painful ride. And so we're explicitly trying to avoid those companies that might be vulnerable with respect to their economic moats, and only look for those companies that we could have confidence that are going to continue to expand their competitive edge.
And we'll get to the other unique parts of the process in a second, but just that idea of a moat, obviously that's come from somewhere, a bit of the history in regards to what the business did previously, and has it always, well, I suppose I'm leading towards, it hasn't always looked at just expanding moats and why that came to be. And maybe if you've got some examples of stocks.
Sure. We quite truthfully, Andrew, we've learned the hard way over the last couple of decades, by investing in companies that simply had wide economic moats. I could give you some examples because they're very easy to relate to, but in the early to mid part of 2000, we were buying certain technology stocks, companies like eBay over Amazon, or Dell over Apple, Yahoo versus Google. The companies that we invested in had wide economic moats, but underneath the surface, they were losing their competitive edge and losing out to the three companies that I mentioned that you could probably surmise that I'm referring to, that were gaining competitive edge, and but it wasn't so clear. But if you take a step back and you look at which companies are growing their competitive advantage, it was the Apples, it was Google, it was Amazon, and so making those three bad decisions almost buried this firm. So the results could be very painful if you stick to just looking at wide economic moat businesses. That's been our experience. So we're really looking for companies that we have confidence that can expand those competitive advantages.
Yeah, and I think that's worthwhile noting that this business over a history of 30 years has made all the mistakes, but happy to recognize it. And we'll talk about that later on in regards to the culture and the culture inside the firm. Can you just talk about the other unique side of the process?
Sure. Well, I won't steal the thunder for JB, but a big part of our process, in addition to looking at widening economic moats, is this idea around culture. And this is just some recognition that the people matter. The people who run the business, who make the decisions, matter a lot. And culture is that the set of values that help drive behaviors. It's the way things get done. And it's not just simply about the numbers, but it's about the people. And so when JB comes on, we'll talk a little bit about our process, what the steps that are involved in looking at culture and the framework that we apply and the reasons why. Some of it is intuitive, right? We know that companies that have strong cultures, or if there is a strong culture, people tend to behave differently. They think about all stakeholders. They tend to approach their jobs differently with more energy. They're not just thinking about what is my job and what is the next job that I might be able to get from this. There's just a different mindset at a culture. And when you're investing long-term like this fund does, we're again looking for companies and we have very low turnover that we think, is going to grow over 5 years. Culture makes a huge difference. If you're a year-to-year investor, maybe you don't need to consider culture. But if you're a long-term investor, if you're really looking for phenomenally great companies as opposed to the merely good companies, culture makes a huge difference.
Well, on that note, we'll hand over to JB, and I think that's this idea of culture and how you measure it and how it fits into a process is really interesting because it is unique. I've never seen it before. I note that you guys at Laguna Beach WCM talk a lot about, valuation and return on invested capital. Those sort of things are just, tickets to the dance. And but this culture and expanding moat idea is how you can measure a company that goes from being a good company to a great company. So JB, on that note, I'd like you to just introduce us to how it was introduced to the firm. This idea of culture, and when you joined back in 2014, I believe, it hadn't been developed at that stage. Do you mind just taking us through that journey?
Sure, absolutely. Brian alluded to it briefly, but I think it's important to kind of discuss, what culture is and isn't. One of my favorite interactions we've had with a manager, it was with Evan Greenberg from Chubb Limited, and beforehand we knew that he was a very culture focused CEO. We had read plenty on kind of his views on culture, and we were kind of very eager to talk to him about culture. So long story short, we jump on the phone with him, in awe to some degree, and as we started to ask about culture, he kind of pauses and said, well, let's back up for a second. He says, everybody talks about culture, but quote, what the F does it really mean? And I think that's kind of an important thing to talk about. So, how the definitions we've settled on is really culture as a common set of norms and values that kind of guide behavior within an organization. And behavior is really kind of the operative term. And to kind of get back to the idea of moat trajectory, we're always framing culture kind of within the context of the investment thesis and ultimately within the context of moat trajectory. So when we think of culture, we think of what behaviors are being driven and to what degree are those supportive of an expanding moat trajectory. In terms of kind of how we kind of got there, the interest in culture at WCM definitely predates me. I think probably the earliest incarnation of it was really just in the insight that culture was really instrumental in terms of kind of the health and kind of performance of WCM itself. And so there's kind of the natural insight that, hey, if it matters here, it probably matters in portfolio companies as well. And so, that initial insight is spot on. There wasn't a lot of, probably in the earliest days, there wasn't a lot of probably sophistication in terms of how culture was thought about. And I think over time, the PMs, Mike Trigg and Pete and Sanjay and others started to develop probably a bit of an intuitive sense around, what to look for in management teams, what to look for in culture, what are some patterns between companies that, tend to do well over the long term versus those that don't from a cultural perspective. And so I would kind of call that maybe stage 1.0 of kind of WCM's culture journey as it relates to the investment process. Stage 2 probably started more in probably the 2015-16 timeframe. And at that time, it was clear that there was a lot of interest in doing more around culture, but as a small team, there was limited bandwidth to really push the kind of framework forward in the way that we really wanted to. And just as a testament to kind of WCM's own internal culture, when I kind of proposed some ideas around ways that we might be able to kind of improve our thinking on culture, I expected, that to be I don't know how it would be received, but, a PM or someone else might kind of run with the idea. And instead they just kind of turned around and said, okay, go do it, go chase these ideas. So it was really kind of a free license to kind of explore what was out there. And the most obvious kind of insight from that whole process was just that there had been a lot of kind of good research done within business schools, all over the world. And also kind of with thought leaders and such that, had been kind of thinking about culture in a more disciplined way than us for a lot longer. And so there was a natural opportunity to kind of bring those insights into the organization. Probably like the most pivotal of those relationships was a kind of a relationship with Jim Heskett. He's a retired HBS professor down in Florida, still very kind of active. He actually he's 80, I think he's 88 now, and he has like a 200 or 300 page book coming out in, I think, a month or two. So quite a spry character, incredibly sharp thinker when it comes to culture. And what really intrigued us about Heskett's work is it was some of the first that we had seen that explicitly tried to tie corporate culture back to financial performance, getting back to this idea that culture is a very kind of, or it's perceived as a very soft and fuzzy kind of ephemeral kind of concept. I think he did a very good job of realizing that if it was going to be taken seriously by business leaders, there needed to be kind of a clear kind of route to the bottom line. And so through kind of that process and working with Heskett, we both kind of created a more kind of robust, rigorous framework around how to assess culture across different companies so that there was some consistency and kind of as much objectivity as you can kind of hope to have. As well as experimenting with creative ways of both kind of sourcing cultural data. You can't look it up in most companies' filings. There's Glassdoor and such, but there's a lot of issues with those sorts of sources. And what we also realized early on was really the key to doing good culture research is understanding kind of the right questions to ask, and kind of most importantly, we'll get to this later, but how to ask them. And so that's been an ongoing journey. And more recently, I think we've been able to benefit from having just a lot of repetitions in terms of doing cultural analysis at companies and kind of improving from a pattern recognition standpoint, and kind of arriving at some of our own markers of effective and what makes for an effective culture versus like a dysfunctional culture that may go beyond what's kind of available in like, kind of the current, academic literature, for example.
Yeah. So I'm a CEO of a company. You guys come to visit me. When you ask me, what's your culture like? I'm going to tell you it's really good. It's fantastic.
Yeah, sure.
So how do you get around that? How do you frame the questions?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this was like that early work I spoke about, our work with Heskett was really, this is one of the challenges. How do you knock CEOs off their canned talking points? I mean, most people who become CEO of, a good sized public company are going to be, very articulate, able to kind of think on their feet, and are honestly pretty good at dodging questions, just to be frank. And one thing that we realized, I think, was that you have to kind of structure your questions around elements of culture that really do kind of trace back to performance. Otherwise, kind of what are you doing? But in terms of how you ask them, that is like kind of the secret sauce in terms of kind of getting beneath kind of the surface level takes beyond kind of mission, vision, values that you can look up on a website, for example, and really understanding again how people are actually making decisions and behaving within an organization. But they have to be approachable. If you come at them with like these overly kind of academic, theoretical questions, you really don't get anywhere. And so if you were a CEO coming and we're going to talk about culture, like something I may ask you would be, if you had let's say a friend, son or daughter who is starting tomorrow at your company and you're going to grab coffee with them in the morning, what would the advice be that you would give them to kind of help them be successful in the organization? Advice that goes beyond, the typical, work hard, those sorts of pieces of advice that are kind of common across any company. Like if you were to give them the inside scoop on like how to be successful within your company in particular, what would you say? We have a whole laundry list of those, but those are sorts of the questions. And like things like another thing we love to like kind of knock people off kind of their canned talking points is like, what's the biggest mistake you've made in the last couple of years? And then we can get into a lot of follow-ups on that, like kind of what learnings came out of it, things like that. But I think those are kind of very straightforward, slightly kind of out of the box questions are pretty helpful. Yeah,
no, that's good. I mean, I'd probably say at the moment you have to be really efficient at homeschooling to work very good at
Sure.
But anyway, but so I'm in China or I'm in India. Am I judged by the same set of cultural standards when you're investing in a firm there and a company there as the United States or Australia, for example? How do you sort of cross-jurisdictional sort of work out what's appropriate? And maybe that's just company to company, but if you can explain the cross-jurisdictional part.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's a great question. And, running a global portfolio is something we run into all the time. I think a good way to think about culture is it's easy to become kind of myopically focused on a particular company's culture, but you really have to kind of understand it within the umbrella of the national culture and potentially even kind of the regional culture or the culture of that company's industry. I mean, I don't have any precise figures around this, but I wouldn't be surprised if 50 to 60% or more of a company's culture is actually more a result of the national culture, industry culture, even though I think people within the organization, it may be difficult for them to see that. I think it's oftentimes the case. I think a way that allows us, so there's a lot of complexity there, obviously. One way, that's one of the advantages of having a lot of repetitions, of doing a lot of different cultural workups on companies, is we are able to kind of spot patterns over time and kind of develop a kind of a benchmark understanding for, what does a typical French culture look like? What does a typical Indian culture look like? Typical Chinese culture look like? What are some of the common issues inherent in companies that are operating within those countries from a cultural perspective? So that's part of it, but there's a lot of complexity there. I think one way to bypass that is to get back to really the kind of the root of it is the culture effective? And even though we don't have, a great basis within Indian culture, for example, when we're out talking to former employees who've worked at these companies, we can essentially lean on their understanding of the culture and kind of not the output of it, but really the effectiveness of it. And so that's kind of a way to kind of bypass, I guess, some of the murkiness you might encounter if you're trying to assess a company in a foreign country that you may not have a lot of familiarity with. Really kind of leaning on people on the ground who do know the kind of the national culture well. It's not a perfect science, though, that's for sure.
I'm going to go to a couple of questions because we've got some interesting ones from the floor, if I can describe it as that. This is from Peter Griffin. How would you describe the culture in WCM? And we go back before, I think there was a quote, we eat what we cook, in regards to PMs and employees investing in the fund. Do you eat what you cook when it comes to culture?
Yeah, it's a fun question. I won't weasel out of you, even though I have an easy way too. So there's I don't know. There's I don't know, actually. It's a fundamental part of if you dive into academic research on culture, there's a principle that essentially you can't understand a culture that you're a part of. It's the classic thing where there's some parable of two fish swimming along. Somebody mentioned something about water and they both go what's water? But that being said, yeah, so the culture of WCM, I mean, at the core of it, we our core values are kind of fun and gratitude. At a surface level, that maybe seems a little bit fluffy, especially if you know that we wear flip-flops and are in Laguna Beach. But if you kind of penetrate below that, actually Mike Trigg on our team wrote a piece about this, but it's essentially the kind of the other stuff. So there's a lot of things about the WCM culture that I think are difficult to understand either by reading the core values or just in kind of casual conversation. The core of it, I would say, would be, we talk about it a bit, not to get kind of too lofty, but it's really kind of a platform that I think has done a very good job of getting kind of the most out of each person. And so it's kind of a way, it's a bit hard to articulate, but I think there's a real energy here around people understanding the uniqueness of the opportunity that they have to kind of learn and grow within the organization and kind of take on more than honestly they're probably qualified to do. I mean, when I started in this role, I had a lot of background interest in culture, but no real kind of formal qualifications. And that's pretty common if you look across kind of the whole organization. I mean, people have fairly eclectic backgrounds. I think we pride ourselves on being a little bit scrappy and unconventional. And that's kind of, I think, driven a little bit of an edge. This predates me, but there's probably a little bit of a chip on our shoulder from kind of way back when we're taken it seriously by, kind of certain institutional investors and such. And so, yeah, I would kind of sum it up as kind of a scrappy, irreverent, a little bit gritty. But at the end of the day, it's incredibly relationship based. I think there's warmer relationships here than I've seen pretty much at any other company. And a depth of those kind of relationships. It's very common to have, I think most people's weekend schedules are on, I wouldn't say dominated with kind of interactions with other people from WCM, but it's very, very common for people to have kind of their core group of friends also be at WCM. It helps that we're in a fairly kind of isolated area in a way. But yeah, I would say relationship-based, scrappy, kind of irreverent. and kind of a strong sense of gratitude for kind of the opportunity that we have.
Yeah, yeah. And can you just finalising on the culture? Do you mind giving us a couple of examples, perhaps of a stock that has gone from good to great or is great compared to its peers because it has a culture that really stands out, and perhaps maybe a stock that because of culture maybe didn't quite get there? If you want to talk about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's funny if you look down, the challenge in this isn't in finding one, it's in deciding which one to kind of speak to. I mean, given how much of a cultural focus there is in the portfolio, it's almost like a who's list of kind of great cultures in the world. At least I'm biased, but I think so. I would say like maybe a good one to think about would be trying to think of one with good people in Australia may be familiar with. I don't know how familiar people are with Shopify. I mean, we reference this one quite a bit, but it's hard not to, just given how exceptional of a culture it really is. So is Shopify, I'm sure most people are aware, but it started as an e-commerce plugin. Actually started as a snowboard store, and before the founder was told that his e-commerce plugin that he built for his snowboard shop online was far more valuable than selling snowboards, but that's another story. But I think the interesting thing about Shopify that has kind of given us confidence to kind of underwrite it in a very meaningful way at very, very significant or very kind of lofty valuations, it really comes back to kind of our faith in the adaptability of the organization. So when I mentioned earlier that we worked with Heskett and others to develop a framework around culture, something that was quickly apparent kind of in the empirical studies that have been on culture is the importance of adaptability. So in a simple sense, it's to what degree is a company kind of attuned to changes when they occur in its external environment? So things like changing customer preferences or maybe changing regulations, maybe a changing competitive landscape. And then two, do they have the kind of the internal flexibility and agility to kind of mount an effective response to that change? So this is reflected both in terms of like innovation and process improvement and kind of strategic pivots, if you will. And at every kind of chapter in Shopify's story we've watched is, it went from a snowboard shop to an e-commerce plugin to today, they have payments, they're going into logistics. And when we look at each kind of stage in that process, the organization has basically been reshuffled to kind of optimize it around whatever kind of the most urgent priority is for the company at the time. Something the co-founder and CEO, Toby, likes to talk about is this concept of kind of being anti-fragile. With the sense that the only way that a company is going to kind of last over the long term is by being flexible, by being adaptable, and really in optimizing around not just the opportunity set that is directly in front of it, but really, as he puts it, finding kind of it's like the absolute maximum of the opportunities. So they very easily could have stayed a snowboard shop. They didn't. They realized that the greater opportunity was in e-commerce. They could have stayed there and done that. They also realized that there is adjacencies in terms of payments, and they executed incredibly well in terms of going after those opportunities. So it's kind of insights like that, coupled with cultural insights like that, covered with kind of proof in the pudding of actually seeing kind of execution follow suit, that allow us to essentially kind of maintain confidence in that the ability of that company to continue to perform.
I'll just ask you one or two more questions before we go back to Brian, where we'll get a bit of a summary on the current outlook and the portfolio, and maybe a couple of stock examples that we can talk to. But just in regards to who you speak to, CEO, speak to ex-employee, what sort of different channels do you go down?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say it's super proprietary, but a little bit of it is. But I think we found a lot of value in speaking to former employees. There's a little bit of nuance to who the best people are to talk to about culture. But in a simple sense, if I were to simplify things, kind of in an ideal scenario, we do a lot of background digging on a culture with former employees. And kind of through other means, and then kind of take that background understanding into our CEO meetings that are focused on culture. So oftentimes we'll do an hour, focus solely on culture with the CEO. To your question earlier around how do you kind of knock these CEOs off their canned talking points? If you come in armed, I mean, we're not adversarial in any way at all, but if you come in armed with a very kind of deep understanding of the culture, kind of the history, why things are the way they are, as well as like the real issues that the company's facing on a go forward basis. That forces a level of candor that I don't think you get otherwise, because in the CEO's mind, you can almost see the switch kind of flip over. They go, okay, these people clearly kind of know what's going on inside the business. I probably wouldn't be a great idea to, BS them, for lack of a better term.
And just because we've got a couple of CEOs and managers and leaders on this call, I know they're there, and I suppose many just look after their small business. What are the books? I think you mentioned Jim Heskett previously, was someone that you've listened to and has helped you on the journey. Is there any books out there that some people should refer to?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say more authors. I like Charles O'Reilly a lot as well. He's up at Stanford. He's done a lot of stuff around innovation, adaptability, kind of culture more broadly. Heskett's book is Win from Within. It comes out in a few months. He also has one called The Culture Cycle that I think came out in 2012 or so. That one's a great kind of overview of it. I'd probably start there. I'm sure others will come to me. Maybe I can send them to you after, and you can include them in like a follow-up email.
And Andrew, maybe I could add something there too. One thing that we've learned over the years of just studying some of the investment greats, like the Warren Buffetts, the Phil Fishers, the Charlie Mungers of the world, is just when you think about some of their success and what they say, they often refer to the qualitative aspect of their approach. We've learned so much from them, and not just the academics, but just the actual investors that we've learned that it's so much more than just doing a DCF, but getting into the weeds and understanding the people who run the business. One book I think that was published in the 50s or 60s from Phil Fisher, Uncommon Profits from Common Stocks, that just really lays out this framework, this checklist of 15 or 20 or so items, and more than 10 of them, or more than half of them, highlight qualitative aspects to a business as part of that checklist, which says a lot to us, in terms of, if they've been so incredibly successful, and some of these lessons are absolutely timeless. There's just a lot to learn from listening to them, because they certainly will share their thoughts around that. I think Charlie Munger and Warren Buffett are prolific in reminding investors just sometimes the fallacy of just making it all about the numbers and less about the people.
Well, while I've got you, Brian, I'm going to come back to you. We're getting a few questions around what I would describe as sort of macro type views that the company might have, and I think that's probably a good time for you to discuss, your views on just macro analysis and top-down work, and how your experience has been. That's there's always a question about interest rates or other things of that nature, but how that is taken into consideration in your process. Sure,
it's a great question. We try to stay macro aware, here at WCM, but in our own experience, and when we have our portfolio manager meetings, if macro comes in and starts dominating the discussion, that's usually when we just kind of call a timeout. What we really want to focus our attention is on the companies, doing the bottom-up fundamental analysis. In our history, when macro has driven our decisions, we've made bad decisions. It's taken us down the wrong road. And our approach really is to identify those companies that can continue to grow and expand and maintain their competitive edge through any cycle, whether it be geopolitical cycle, macro cycle, rate cycle. We're specifically looking for companies that we think can withstand some of those forces. So we like to stay macro aware, but we don't want it to drive our process. We're looking for companies, again, that can fight those pressures of macro. And frankly, we've used macro as a good timing tool in the sense that when people are very concerned about macro, when it's led to an across-the-board derating of a country or group of stocks, when it's led to indiscriminate selling, we've used those type of events to upgrade our portfolio. And we have some examples of doing such things in the last decade or so. When Brazil, for example, was under a lot of pressure, that's when we we went to Brazil and met with a bunch of companies to find those individual enterprises that are focused on just driving value over the next 5 to 10 years. It's part of how we found Mercado Libre, one of our most successful investments as a firm. So that's just one example of us using macro perhaps to our advantage as a timing tool or as a place to enter stocks.
Well, on that note, I'm going to ask you a little bit about Mercado Libre, and if you could give us a bit of insight into that company and why it's in the portfolio. And I suppose that leads into another question that's been asked up here in regards to COVID and the fact that the team probably has found it pretty tough to travel. I know you haven't been out to Australia in the last 12 months, right? Sounds like it's disappointing everybody over there. But how has COVID affected your ability to get down, talk about the culture, understand expanding moats, understand companies?
Sure. Yeah, I'll address that first. Yeah, you're right. The borders are off. We aren't able to do international travel like we have, but there's been some benefits from that as well. The companies themselves aren't traveling, so our access to management teams is better than it's ever been before. And having us all together, mostly virtually, but also on occasion here in the office collaborating together has made it quite easy because people are less, they're spending less time on planes and things like that, attending conferences. So I think we've also been able to dig deeper into different resources that we didn't have the time to dig into before. So broaden our number of contacts, our scope of contacts. I think we've gotten better too with the types of questions that we've been able to ask over virtual, Zoom presentations or over the phone. So I think we've taken advantage of the situation as best we possibly can, but we are looking forward to getting back out on the road. There's nothing that does replace face-to-face interactions, and we're all dying to go to Australia.
We're looking forward to having you down here. We've got quite a cast on today, and prefer to see you inside an auditorium somewhere. Just a general outlook, and portfolio position in relation to sectors and countries, etc. If you can just touch on that.
Sure. We got a really well-balanced portfolio. We invest across the entire growth spectrum, if you will. We have companies that are growing mid to high single digits all the way up to 50% or more. That's by design. It's diverse from a geographic perspective. We have great companies in Europe, Asia, Australia. I take that back, not Australia, but including just the entire Asia region and Latin America, and of course here in the U.S. About 50% of our portfolio is in U.S. companies currently, which is still well below or a few hundred basis points below the benchmark. We're excited about what we own, and we have a really full pipeline of some really exciting stocks. We've made a couple of additions to the portfolio. We've trimmed a few of our winners recently. We like where it's positioned. Our focus is always, the primary criteria is around quality. So really like the quality of the portfolio that we have now. A couple of stocks that I can mention that we added to the portfolio in the first half of the year, a company like Entegris, which is a niche supplier to the semiconductor industry. Essentially has two main businesses, or applying different gases and liquids on top of semiconductors that gets etched away. It's really important as the industry moves to leading edge, so 7 nanometer and below. When you get to the leading edge, there's just the complexity increases and their content per wafer increases. So Entegris, we think, is really well positioned to help solve this chip shortage, but also help these companies achieve the yields that they need to get from the manufacturing at the leading edge. A company like Evolution, we added to the portfolio. Really excited about this stock. They make live casino content for operators. So they're supplying this studio-generated gaming entertainment with live dealers so players, gamblers could interact directly with the dealer and with other players. Really are the only one that is able to do it with any scale, with highly well done studio content that scales very rapidly. They're growing, obviously, in Europe and America, and also in Asia. And it's a beautiful, beautiful business model with nearly 70% EBITDA margin. So excited about what some of the new additions that we made to the portfolio, but the focus is always around making sure that we have the highest quality ideas. And also, of course, just managing risk, which we do through portfolio construction, but also some mechanical limitations to around the sector and industry exposure, as well as position size and country.
Good. Well, I'll take one more question from the floor here, which is around you trimming winners. One of those things, the reason you trim is to maintain a balanced portfolio. Do you tend to turn over the portfolio a lot? Do the new names pop in and out of the portfolio? What can we expect from that sort of perspective?
Yeah. This is a lower turnover portfolio. We generally have anywhere between 25 and 30% on average turnover. About a third or up to a half is just, adds and trim. So the actual name turnover is actually quite less. It might be closer to 15 to 20%. So we really have a long-term perspective when we make investments, investing over 5 years or more. So that's how we approach turnover. How we think about adding and trimming, we have an upper limit of 10%, but we never get there. We typically if a position gets to about 5 to 6%, we're paring it back. So long as the competitive advantages are continuing to expand, the company is continuing to get better, we're likely to trim back or pare back that position, but keep the stock in the portfolio. Some of our best decisions have been to continue to own a stock, but manage the position size. We don't want a position size to get too big because that could be a real distraction to the portfolio managers, and it could add more risk and volatility to our fund holders. So there are other reasons too why we like to keep it an upper limit of about 5.5 to 6%, because we don't want that to happen. That could just take an outsized portion of our PM's attention and has it carries additional risk to the portfolio as well.
And once again, another question has just come from the floor, and this may be either you or JB. Can you provide an example of a holding that experienced an adverse change in culture and caused you to sell the position?
Sure. I mean, oftentimes there's other factors that contribute to it as well, but when we're involved with Under Armour, culture definitely factored into that decision. So essentially what was going on there, and it's like a common challenge that we see fast-growing companies encounter, kind of common growing pains, was the style of leadership. To put it more bluntly, there's a lot of micromanagement going on. And what we saw was kind of a failure for the leadership team to kind of outgrow that style. And it worked okay when they were principally going after kind of US consumers of sports apparel. So, wicking base layers for football players, for example. The management team knew that audience really well because a lot of the management team were actually former, college athletes, college football players themselves. Where they started to run into trouble was part of our investment thesis really hinged on their ability to go into footwear, go into kind of lifestyle or athleisure and into international markets in more meaningful ways, really as kind to provide a platform for future growth and to help diversify the business. The problem with this is what we didn't see happen was they actually hired some good external people with experience in these areas. I think most notably, story I came across was they actually plucked away a few really talented footwear designers from Nike. People in the industry thought it was, almost like a coup, like that was unheard of. Unfortunately, we then started to, so that was a, kind of a positive marker, if you will, in terms of their cultural journey and trajectory. We were looking for them kind of leveling up and scaling the culture and the talent to essentially enable them to go after these other opportunities. What started to filter out after that, though, were stories of executives coming in and basically changing these really important details or colorways on shoes, for example, that these designers had spent, the last 6 months or the last 9 months perfecting. And from the outside, we started to see churn. So, they went through a few good CEOs, a few good marketing executives. The designers that we mentioned, I think, left, don't quote me on this, but, roughly a year after joining. And so kind of across the board, we saw this pattern where management was basically failing to make the best use of the type of talent and the type of people that they would need to unlock the next leg of growth. So we had far less confidence in kind of the forward-looking prospects of their ability to kind of execute on these other opportunities. There are other things at play as well, but that's a pretty good example of an instance of when we were very positive on a culture, and then, you know, as we continue to watch it, we actually turned negative on it.
Right. Well, I think we get to, it's 10:46 local time down here, and we've kept people on for a while. And I'd just like to thank you both, Brian and JB, for your contribution today. It's been great. Thank you, guys.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew.
A
And
pleasure.
yeah, thank you. And further to that, if people that are listening have questions, please go to the Contengo website, www.contengo.com.au. You can access this product, as I said earlier, in 4 different forms. There is an LIC, an ETF, and 2 unit trusts, 1 hedged and 1 unhedged. So they're the access points for that. Okay, everybody, thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate the amount of people that turned up today. It's been terrific. And once again, guys, thanks for your time.
Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you, Andrew. Thanks, everyone.